You are sitting in absolute suffocating darkness. The air in the stone cell is freezing, thick with the scent of damp earth and trapped fear. You hear the heavy metallic scrape of a key turning in an iron lock, followed by the dull thud of heavy boots stepping onto the stone floor. A rusted contraption is held out in the dim light, and you realize with a sudden, paralyzing clarity that it is meant for your head.
This was not a nightmare. This was the legally sanctioned reality for a woman in the parish of St. Andrews, Scotland, in the winter of 1592. The men stepping into her cell were not outlaws or rogues. They were officers of the court. They had not come to execute her, but to administer a punishment far more insidious, engineered to break her mind and erase her voice entirely. She presses herself against the freezing, damp wall of the lockup, desperate to control the ragged rhythm of her own breathing. A beam of gray, unforgiving morning light cuts through the gloom as the blacksmith steps closer, holding a cage forged of heavy, dark iron. It is an intricate, cruel device, a hollowed-out skull of rusted metal. At its peak sits a tiny mocking addition, a small iron bell, waiting to ring. Before she can process the sheer weight of the object, rough hands seize her shoulders and pin her against the stone. The blacksmith forces her jaw open, his fingers calloused and entirely devoid of mercy. He shoves a flat, textured piece of iron deep into her mouth. If she swallows naturally, the metal will tear her. If she tries to speak, the physical damage will be irreversible. The blacksmith swings the hinged iron bands around the sides of her face, locking them tightly at the base of her skull with a heavy iron padlock. The freezing chill of the metal bites into her skin, while the suffocating smell of the unwashed wool coat fills her nostrils. She is entirely trapped within her own head, forced to breathe around the heavy intrusion occupying her mouth. The official steps forward and attaches a thick leather leash to an iron ring at the front of the mask. With a sudden, violent jerk, he pulls her to her feet. Ahead of them, the heavy wooden doors of the jail begin to groan open. She must somehow survive the gauntlet of the town square, knowing a single misstep could silence her forever.
The visceral panic of her forced march through those cobblestones stands in stark contrast to the sterile, quiet archives where this history is preserved today. This brutal mechanism was not some rogue instrument of medieval fantasy. It was an entirely legal, state-sanctioned device used extensively throughout Renaissance-era Scotland and England. Examining a surviving artifact from this era under the bright lights of a modern museum reveals the terrifying precision of its design. Often referred to as a Brank, the Scold's Bridle was an engineering marvel of psychological suppression. Contemporary records show a disturbing variety in the construction of the mouthpieces. Some were smooth, heavy weights meant merely to exhaust the jaw muscles, while others were shaped like industrial rasps. The intent was mathematically clear: to make the involuntary act of swallowing an agonizing ordeal. But why would a supposedly civilized society authorize such extreme measures against its own citizens? The answer lies in the English common law designation of a common scold. This legal code categorized outspoken, argumentative, or simply inconvenient women as public nuisances. Their words were equated to criminal acts, justifying what we would now recognize as state-sponsored bodily harm. This was not vigilante justice carried out by angry husbands in the dead of night, as popular myth often suggests. The deployment of the bridle was officially ordered by respected magistrates, wealthy mayors, and devout parish priests. It was a calculated, highly bureaucratic process of breaking a human being. Yet a lingering, deeply unsettling question remains. How did an allegedly enlightened, post-Reformation society convince itself that muzzling a woman like aggressive livestock was a moral necessity? To truly understand the sheer dread associated with the iron cage, we have to look closely at what exactly these women were whispering that terrified the highest levels of power so much.
The idea that the bridle was merely a domestic tool for frustrated husbands dealing with irritating wives is a modern, sanitized myth. To understand the 16th century mindset, we must look at the rigid socio-religious hierarchy of post-Reformation Europe. Society was structured as an unbroken chain of authority ordained by the divine, meaning to challenge a man of standing was to challenge the Almighty himself. According to the Kirk session records of the era, the women branded as Scalds were rarely mere gossips. They were widows refusing to be quietly dispossessed of their property, women protesting suffocating local taxes, or individuals who dared to publicly accuse powerful men of abuse. A woman's unregulated speech was viewed as an inherent danger to the state, an unchecked spark that could ignite subversion. The bridle, therefore, was not a simple punishment for a bad temper, but a highly calculated socio-political weapon designed to violently reinforce the established order. But for a woman like her, this systemic paranoia was not some abstract philosophical concept studied by academics. It was a sudden, terrifying decree delivered by the very men she saw every day. Just 3 days before the iron closed around her face, she stood in the claustrophobic, candlelit parish courtroom, fighting desperately for her own survival. The air in the chamber is suffocatingly hot, thick with the smell of melting tallow and the incessant, nervous whispering of the villagers gathered behind her. She is exhausted, pleading her case before a profoundly impassive local magistrate. A wealthy, influential landowner has quietly swallowed up the small plot of land she relies on to survive. She presents her evidence, but the magistrate dismisses her claim with a wave of his hand and a barely concealed sneer. Driven to the absolute edge of ruin, she commits the ultimate transgression of her era. She loses her temper. She raises her voice above the murmurs of the room and calls the magistrate exactly what he is, a thief. The courtroom falls into a sudden, suffocating silence.
The cause and effect of her outburst is devastatingly immediate. The magistrate does not argue the facts of the property dispute. He simply extends a trembling, rage-filled finger toward her and pronounces a single, heavy word: Scold. It is tempting to look at the heavy iron bridle as the ultimate cruelty of its time, a barbaric anomaly. But examining the intersection of 17th century municipal laws and the continent-wide witch crazes reveals a deeply disturbing historical reframe. According to the legal doctrines of the era, locking a woman inside an iron mask was not actually considered torture. It was officially categorized by the courts as a leniency. During this exact period, the violent paranoia surrounding witchcraft was reaching a fever pitch across Europe. Scholars now understand that an aggressively outspoken woman was frequently categorized by authorities as a witch in training. A sharp, defiant tongue was viewed as the very first symptom of demonic influence, an infection of the spirit that required immediate, aggressive intervention. Therefore, placing a woman in the Brank was presented to the public as a twisted form of mercy. It was framed as a necessary corrective measure to cure her of her rebellious nature before the state was forced to burn her at the stake. This horrifying context completely changes our understanding of the device and the ordeal of the women forced to wear it. Consider the small iron bell welded to the top of the cage. It wasn't merely a cruel decorative embellishment meant to mock the victim.
It was an auditory weapon engineered to strip away her humanity, transforming a private citizen into a walking, ringing spectacle of state control. Armed with this historical reality, the true nature of her sentence becomes clear. As she steps out of the darkness and into the roaring town square, she is about to realize that the suffocating physical agony of the iron is nothing compared to the psychological slaughter waiting for her. The heavy wooden doors of the jailhouse slam shut behind her, cutting off any final hope of retreat. She cannot swallow the pooling saliva. A thin, terrifying trickle of fluid runs down her chin, staining the collar of her dress. The world around her narrows into an overwhelming, disorienting assault on the senses. The stench of unwashed bodies and damp wool rises from the tightly packed street, suffocating her as she struggles to draw thin breaths around the rusted iron bit. Through the narrow gaps in the metal cage, blurry shapes of familiar faces twist into grotesque masks of mockery and contempt. Children she once watched play in the surrounding fields now hurl rotting refuse that strikes her shoulders and face. The psychological weight of this sudden, total societal betrayal begins to crush her spirit faster than the iron locking her jaw. The physical tension is agonizing. Every time the official pulls the leather leash to keep her moving forward, the spiked iron plate digs deeper. She is quietly suffocating, utterly defenseless, forced to endure the relentless, deafening jeers of the mob. The ceaseless ringing of the bell echoes inside the metal cage, vibrating through her teeth and drowning out her own frantic internal thoughts. Her vision blurs with tears of sheer rising panic. Agnes catches her footing on the slick cobblestones just a fraction of a second before the iron bit can tear through the muscle. The desperate, violent effort to keep her balance burns away the very last reserves of her adrenaline, leaving her limbs trembling and weak. The official drags her the final few yards to the foot of the massive stone pillar towering over the market square as the ultimate symbol of the town's authority. With a dull, metallic clank, he loops the heavy leather leash through an iron ring on the stone cross and secures it with a padlock. She is tethered there, entirely exposed to the elements and the judgment of the town, as the morning drags relentlessly into afternoon. The discordant little bell welded to the top of her cage, which had been ringing relentlessly since she left the damp cell, finally falls completely silent. It stops not because the authorities have shown mercy, but because she has entirely ceased to struggle.
Through the narrow, rusted bars of her mask, she looks out at the other women of the village passing by the cross. One by one, as her gaze meets theirs, they quickly avert their eyes, staring down at the muddy cobblestones, their postures rigid and entirely subdued. The grotesque theater has worked perfectly. She watches as her neighbors internalize the silence the state has demanded of them. As the shadows lengthen across the square, the magistrate finally steps out from the courthouse and gestures for the heavy locks to be undone. The beadle steps forward with his rusted iron key, but a chilling, unspoken reality hangs heavy in the evening air. What happens to a human being when the heavy iron is finally unlatched and taken away, but the suffocating terror of the cage remains permanently locked inside the mind? When the magistrate finally signaled the beadle to unlock the heavy iron padlocks, the immediate ordeal ended, but the true nightmare was only just beginning. The physical toll on the jaw and mouth was devastating, leaving permanent, hidden scars that would ache in the cold for the rest of a victim's life. But modern historians point out that the ultimate consequence was not written on the body at all. It was a complete and permanent social death. Women like Agnes, who had once fought fiercely and vocally for their livelihoods, were entirely broken by the spectacle. Surviving records indicate that those who endured the bridle rarely, if ever, spoke in a public forum again. They retreated into the shadows of their own lives, carrying the invisible weight of the iron cage long after it was removed.
So, how did history handle this systematic state-sanctioned suppression? It deliberately sanitized it. Over the centuries, the profound psychological trauma of thousands of women was aggressively erased from the public consciousness. These horrifying instruments of control were stripped of their dark context, tossed into oddity museums, and rebranded as quirky, comical jokes about nagging wives from a less enlightened age. The legal deployment of the Brank eventually faded from the books by the 19th century, but scholars warn against viewing this as a sudden, miraculous wave of empathy from the ruling class. The state simply evolved its tactics.
They no longer needed to rely on crude, rusted metal because they had developed far more sophisticated, invisible methods to ensure compliance and quietly silence dissent. The iron cages may have rusted away in sterile glass display cases, but the deep cultural impulse to isolate, mock, and destroy a loud or difficult woman never truly vanished. It just changed its shape. If this journey into the sanitized corners of our past changed how you view history, leave a like and subscribe to join the investigation. Then click the video on your screen to uncover the next dark truth they tried to bury.